What do you think the significance this year of the SCO, and what kind of outcome would you expect at a time, of course, after Vladimir Putin has consolidated his support from North Korea? He's also had a recent meeting with Xi Jinping. What do you think is going to be the top takeaway from this SCO?
Well, talking to my contacts in the SCO, including some very high-level officials, I think the topics that they're discussing are a little bit more mundane and future-oriented. I think they realize that they've had several years of success, that they're still growing. I think they're still interested in trying to move forward with humanitarian and cultural and economic programs. I think there's some concern that they lack a financial structure or institution to support some of their grander ideas. Of course, we see some states like Iran and Russia trying to promote de-dollarization. There's some debates over what should be the official language, with Russia and China reportedly not that interested in English being the official language, but the other states remaining committed to it. So a lot of it's rather mundane. I don't think we're going to see any major breakthroughs, but I think we do have to understand that the SCO does provide or play a very significant role in promoting positive relations in this region.
Yeah, and to your point, Joseph, David here, by the way, perhaps the most globally relevant pair here would be, to Steve's earlier point, Russia and China. How would you best describe the current relationship between the two at this point?
Well, I think, given your lead-in with President Stubb of Finland, I think there's this misunderstanding in Europe that China is somehow the shot caller when it comes to Russia and even the conflict in Ukraine. Certainly, they have a lot of strategic alignment. The thing that I would point out to my European colleagues is that China recently signed a strategic partnership with Bahrain, which is, home to the U.S. Fifth Fleet. It has a strategic partnership with Australia. It has a lot of them with many different countries. But that strategic partnership really began to accelerate, by the way, through the auspices of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, following the U.S. penetration of Central Asia with the invasion of Afghanistan, which, as we recall, the United States built air bases in former Soviet republics, which created a lot of unease in both Beijing and Moscow. And it continues, this strategic partnership continues today, given the significant threat posed by U.S. submarines against China in the South China Sea, and certainly the U.S. Missile boats under the ice, which China needs Russian support to help mitigate those threats. So, the point is that, and there's the other issue, which is, back with the first Gulf War, there's some strategic analysis that indicates that the United States was putting that huge footprint in the Middle East in order to be able to lock up global oil supplies with China in mind as a strategic objective towards China. And this is what forced China to diversify its energy sourcing in Africa and certainly Russia. So we have this strategic partnership that exists between Russia and China, but it's one that has largely been a reaction to the threats that both countries face or vulnerabilities they face vis-a-vis the United States.
Joseph, this is not intended to be a loaded question, but how much reputational damage in Europe, obviously in the United States perhaps, has China taken for aligning itself with Moscow as the war enters its third year? You're in the Shanghai studio a week ago. I was in the exact same position there, speaking to the U.S. ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, who essentially said that China had misjudged the impact of the war on the relations that Europe has with China. Would you agree with that? And what kind of reputational damage does China suffer from this?
Well, I would not find myself in general agreement with Ambassador Burns. But what I would say is that China has long been aware that taking a neutral position, that it is not aligned with Russia over the conflict in Ukraine, but taking a neutral position would be very costly in terms of its relationships with Europe, and it indeed has been costly. I was in Ukraine last summer doing field work, and by the way, everyone I spoke with in Ukraine, including Azov Representatives near the front, everyone there seemed to understand that this was not an unprovoked war of aggression, that this was a proxy war between the United States and Russia, fighting over control of oil markets and how energy is paid for. And that all three countries bore significant responsibility for the conflict that was happening there. And by three countries, I mean Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. That's the common understanding in Ukraine, but that's not the understanding that we hear from people like President Stubb, who, continue with this narrative that Russia is an imperial power, that they are attacking Europe, and that China is somehow responsible or should be responsible for that. So I dismiss this idea, but I think China is very much concerned with the fact that they have paid a substantial price in terms of their relationship with Europe. And I think they've always been aware that whatever benefits they got in terms of their relationship with Russia, it would by no means compensate for the losses. And I do think that, early in the war, China was very much interested in trying to promote peace because they saw this problem coming. But I think they also understood that neither Washington nor Moscow were ready to move forward. And so China has bided its time.
Right. Joseph, you brought up the U.S. there, so we can pivot to the U.S. right now. And I'm curious what the mood on the ground is and around, well, a couple of topics, and if you could give your opinion on both. The disastrous debate, of course, Joe Biden late last week, that's number one. And number two is if it is Trump 2.0, and Donald Trump has repeatedly said that U.S. allies have to do more of the heavy lifting abroad, including, to your point, on the military. Does that counterintuitively mean as tensions come down and the U.S. steps back from many of these fronts?
I don't know. I think that we've seen a number of people who are, perhaps connected with the Trump camp in one form or another, saying a lot of provocative things. And it's really difficult to know what he's going to do or what he's thinking, or indeed if he's even going to win. There is obviously increased concern after the debate. I think the position in China remains that both Trump and Biden present risks for China. And I think the consensus remains that Trump is still a wild card. And Beijing dislikes wild cards. They dislike instability. But they do think that Trump could harm China, but also the U.S. interest in terms of Biden being a very careful bloc builder, a strategic builder. It could be that Trump could wreck a lot of those relationships. But, I think this is playing out in various ways. I think a lot of countries right now are hedging. No one really knows what's going to come in the next 6 months to a year. And certainly I think it's having some impact on some of the thinking that we might see coming out of the third plenum, in so much as China is trying to consider how deep it needs to go in terms of addressing some of its structural reforms.
You mentioned the Finnish president there. Obviously, he has his concerns, too, because they have that lengthy border with Russia. And that kind of pivots to the next question about what David just asked about Donald Trump. There's speculation he could potentially, as David also alluded to, undermine the authority of NATO, which could potentially cool things, but it could also potentially undermine NATO at this time. How do you see this?
Well, again, it's really sort of a remarkable change. We saw the incredible pressure that Trump is bringing against NATO, and certainly unnerving Europe. We know that Trump was a steadfast supporter of Brexit, and that Brexit has been extremely destructive in the UK. At least that's what we see from the opinion polls now in the UK, that this was really a disastrous path to take. And I think there's this understanding in Europe that the U.S. has by various turns either undermined European security and well-being, and therefore created a security trap that required more dependence on organizations like NATO. Conversely, we have someone like Trump who might come back and take it in a different direction. But again, no one really knows. I think it's sort of remarkable that the whole world at this moment is kind of fixated on what American voters are going to do. And indeed, American voters in 5 or 6 states are going to have such a tremendous impact on what we see coming in the next year or so.